In a time when legends were made by bullets and blood, few names stirred as much fear as Cherokee Bill. Born into a world of chaos, violence, and racial tension, he blazed a brutal path across the Indian Territory, leaving lawmen dead and entire towns paralyzed in his wake. He was young, he was deadly, and he didn't care who got in his way. Some called him a hero of resistance. Most called him a cold-blooded killer. So who was the real Cherokee Bill? And why does his story still haunt the forgotten corners of the Old West?
Crawford Goldsby, better known by the name Cherokee Bill, became a well-known figure in the American Old West. Active for a little over 2 years, he and a group of associates gained notoriety throughout Indian Territory. During that time, he was held responsible for the deaths of 8 men, including a relative by marriage. Goldsby's family background was deeply rooted in the complexities of post-Civil War America. His father, George Goldsby, was born in Perry County, Alabama, on February 22, 1843. George served as a sergeant in the 10th United States Cavalry, one of the black regiments commonly referred to as Buffalo Soldiers. His heritage traced back to Thornton Goldsby of Selma and Hester King, who lived independently on land west of Summerfield Road, between Selma and Marion, Alabama. George noted that he had several siblings, Crawford, Abner, Joseph, Blevins, Mary, and Susie, all born of the same parents. Crawford's mother, Ellen Beck Goldsby Lynch, was a Cherokee freedwoman. Her ancestry was mixed, African, Cherokee, and white, and she was born in the Delaware district of the Cherokee Nation. Ellen is recorded on the Dawes Rolls, the official registry used to document citizens of Native American tribes in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Her Cherokee lineage came through her father. Ellen's parents, Tempe and Luke Beck, had previously lived in slavery under Jeffrey Beck, a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. After emancipation, the family remained in Indian Territory, where they continued to build their lives. Crawford grew up with 3 siblings, a sister named Georgia, and 2 brothers, Luther and Clarence. Like their mother, they too are listed on the Dawes Rolls. This background, military service, tribal identity, and the legacy of enslavement shaped much of the world Crawford Goldsby would eventually navigate as a young man in a rapidly changing frontier society. During the American Civil War, George Goldsby initially worked as a hired servant for a Confederate infantry regiment. However, while present at the Battle of Gettysburg, he made a pivotal decision to leave that role. He traveled to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where he began working as a teamster, someone responsible for driving supply wagons for a Union Army quartermaster unit. Shortly afterward, George enlisted in the 21st Pennsylvania Cavalry Regiment, presenting himself as a white man and using the name George Gooseby. Historical records show that the spelling of this alias occasionally varied, appearing as Gooseby or Goosley in different documents. Following the end of the war, George returned to his hometown near Selma, Alabama. However, local sentiment at the time was highly charged, and word began to spread that some individuals might retaliate against him for having supported the Union cause. Concerned for his safety, George decided to leave Alabama and headed west to Indian Territory. In 1867, he formally joined the 10th Cavalry Regiment, one of the original units of the Buffalo Soldiers, this time under his true name. Over the next few years, he advanced through the ranks, and by 1872, he had achieved the position of Sergeant Major. After completing his initial 5-year enlistment, he re-enlisted and was appointed First Sergeant of Company D, continuing his military career with distinction. Cherokee Bill's early life. Crawford Goldsby was born on February 8, 1876, at Fort Concho in San Angelo, Texas, to Sergeant George Goldsby and Ellen Beck Goldsby. His birth came during a period of transition and tension in post-Reconstruction Texas. By 1878, when Crawford was just 2 years old, tensions began to rise in San Angelo between African-American soldiers stationed at the fort and groups of local cowboys and hunters. A key incident that intensified the conflict occurred at Morris's saloon, where a group of civilians reportedly confronted and disrespected a sergeant from Company D by forcibly removing the insignia from his uniform. The sergeant returned to the fort and sought support from his fellow soldiers. They armed themselves and returned to the town to assert their position. The situation escalated quickly, and a confrontation took place that resulted in several casualties on both sides, drawing serious attention from both military and civilian authorities. In the aftermath, Texas Ranger Captain G.W. Arrington and his men entered Fort Concho to apprehend George Goldsby, accusing him of supplying arms to the troops involved. However, Colonel Benjamin Grierson, the commanding officer at the fort, disputed the Rangers' legal authority to conduct arrests within a federal military installation. Recognizing the risk of remaining vulnerable outside military protection, George Goldsby ultimately left the post without formal leave. He made his way into Indian Territory, effectively removing himself from the situation in Texas. Following these events, Ellen Goldsby eventually relocated with her family to Fort Gibson in Indian Territory. However, she did not take Crawford with her right away. Instead, she entrusted his care to an elderly African-American woman named Auntie Amanda Foster, who raised him until the age of 7. Afterward, Crawford was enrolled in an Indian school in Cherokee, Kansas, where he received part of his early education. By the age of 12, he returned home to Fort Gibson, rejoining his family and beginning the next chapter of his life in a region shaped by cultural intersections and rapid change. When Crawford Goldsby returned home, he discovered that his mother, Ellen Goldsby, had remarried. After leaving Fort Apache, she traveled to Kansas City, Missouri, where on June 27, 1889, she married William Lynch. Following their marriage, the couple continued on to Fort Gibson. William Lynch was originally from Waynesville, Ohio, and served as a private in Troop K of the 9th Cavalry. Prior to that, he had completed an earlier term of service with Troop H of the 10th Cavalry. Ellen herself held an official role with the military. She was the certified laundress for Troop D of the 10th Cavalry. This position entitled her to military rations, housing, and transportation, and she remained with the unit across various posts, including Fort Davis, Texas, Fort Grant, Arizona, and Fort Apache, Arizona. Despite Ellen's continued military association, Crawford's relationship with his new stepfather was strained. The two did not get along well, and this contributed to a growing sense of unrest in Crawford's personal life. During this period, he began spending time with individuals who had questionable reputations, started drinking alcohol, and began to disregard rules and authority figures. By the time he turned 15, Crawford had left his mother's household and moved in with his sister Georgia and her husband Mose Brown near Nowata, Oklahoma. However, tensions also developed in that home. Crawford and Mose did not have a harmonious relationship, and Crawford eventually left. He then returned to Fort Gibson, where he took up residence with a local man named Bud Buffington. During this time, Crawford supported himself by working a series of odd jobs, reflecting a period of instability and restlessness in his teenage years. Life as an outlaw. Crawford. Goldsby's path toward a life outside the law began around the age of 18. While attending a dance in Fort Gibson, a disagreement arose between him and a man named Jake Lewis. The dispute wasn't directly between the two men, but rather stemmed from an earlier issue Lewis had with one of Crawford's brothers. The tension escalated quickly. A few days after the incident, Crawford armed himself with a 6-shooter and encountered Jake Lewis again. He fired at Lewis and, believing he had inflicted fatal harm, fled Fort Gibson. He traveled into the Creek and Seminole Nations, seeking to avoid capture. It was during this time that he met Jim and Bill Cook, two men of mixed Cherokee heritage who were already living outside the boundaries of legal authority. Contrary to what Crawford believed, Jake Lewis survived the incident and eventually filed formal charges. Goldsby's actions now placed him firmly on the radar of federal authorities. Meanwhile, in the summer of 1894, the U.S. government negotiated the purchase of a strip of Cherokee land, offering a financial settlement to recognize citizens of the Cherokee Nation. Each individual with a legal claim was entitled to receive $265.70, which would be roughly equivalent to $10,656 in 2025 dollars, a significant amount at the time. Since Crawford Goldsby and the Cook brothers were enrolled members of the Cherokee Nation, they traveled to Tahlequah, Oklahoma, the tribal capital, in hopes of collecting their share of the payout. At this point in time, Crawford Goldsby was being sought by law enforcement for his earlier involvement in the shooting of Jake Lewis. Meanwhile, Jim Cook faced larceny charges. Wanting to avoid contact with authorities, the two men, along with Bill Cook, sought refuge at a hotel and restaurant operated by an acquaintance named Effie Crittenden. Rather than risk being recognized in Tahlequah, the men persuaded Effie to travel there on their behalf to collect the funds they were owed from the recent Cherokee land settlement. However, her movements did not go unnoticed. On her return journey, she was followed by Sheriff Ellis Rattling Gord, who had been tracking Goldsby and the Cook brothers with the hope of making an arrest. On June 17, 1894, a confrontation occurred between Sheriff Rattling Gord's posse and the group. During the exchange, Deputy Sequoyah Houston lost his life and Jim Cook sustained injuries. The lawmen eventually withdrew from the scene. Following the incident, authorities questioned Effie Crittenden about the identity of those involved. She responded by clarifying that the individual was not Crawford Goldsby by name, but a man who went by the nickname Cherokee Bill. From that point forward, the alias Cherokee Bill stuck, and Goldsby gained a growing reputation across Indian Territory. Soon after, Crawford Goldsby and the Cook brothers officially formed what became known as the Cook Gang. Over the next few months, particularly between August and October of 1894, the group committed a series of robberies, targeting banks, stagecoaches, and general stores throughout the region. These actions further fueled Goldsby's notoriety. During this period, Goldsby began to suffer from a hereditary condition believed to have been passed down from his grandfather, which caused premature hair loss. As the condition progressed, he eventually chose to shave his head, a look that became part of his distinct and recognizable appearance. Crimes involving Cherokee Bill, the series of incidents connected to Crawford Goldsby, also known as Cherokee Bill, began to draw increasing attention during the spring and summer of 1894. On May 26th, a minor theft occurred at T.H. Scales's general store in Wetumpka, Oklahoma, where just 35 cents was reportedly taken. While the amount was small, it marked the beginning of a pattern of more serious offenses. On June 17, 1894, a confrontation took place during a pursuit led by Deputy Sequoyah Houston, who was attempting to capture Goldsby and the Cook Gang. The encounter resulted in the death of Deputy Houston, further escalating efforts to apprehend those involved. On July 4th, during a railroad stop near Fort Gibson, a brakeman named Samuel Collins was shot after removing an individual who had attempted to board without paying. A second person, described at the time as a tramp, tried to flee and was also shot. The injuries proved fatal for both men, according to accounts published in 1896. Witnesses and later reports identified Goldsby as the person responsible. 2 days later, on July 6, an incident in Nowata, Oklahoma, involved the station agent A.L. Dick Richards of the Mississippi Railway. He was reportedly shot and killed, and while Cherokee Bill was named as the suspect and allegedly spoke of the event afterward, he later denied involvement. On July 18th, Goldsby and members of his gang carried out a robbery of a Wells Fargo Express shipment aboard a St. Louis and San Francisco Railroad train near Red Fork, Indian Territory. This marked one of their most high-profile train robberies during that period. Later that month, on July 30th, the gang struck again, this time at the Lincoln County Bank in Chandler, Oklahoma. They reportedly escaped with $500, a substantial sum for the time. During the robbery, a man named J.B. Mitchell was fatally injured. In September 1894, Crawford Goldsby was involved in a tragic family dispute that ended with the death of his brother-in-law, Joseph Mose Brown. Historical accounts differ on the cause. Some suggest it was due to a disagreement over the ownership of livestock, while others imply Goldsby may have believed Brown had received an unfair share of the family inheritance. Later that same month, on September 14th, Parkinson's store in Okmulgee, Oklahoma, was robbed. Goldsby was identified as one of the participants in the incident. On October 9, 1894, another robbery took place at the express office and train depot in Shuto, Oklahoma. This event continued a pattern of coordinated thefts attributed to Goldsby and his associates. Just over a week later, on October 20th, a train was held up near Coriata, Oklahoma, marking another bold act by the group. 2 days after that, on October 22nd, Goldsby, along with 3 others, carried out a robbery at Watova, Oklahoma, targeting both the local post office and Donaldson's store. On November 8, 1894, the group entered Shufeld and Soon General Store during a planned theft. During the robbery, a man named Ernest Melton entered the store unexpectedly and was killed in the chaos that followed. The final known incident of that year occurred on December 23, 1894, when Goldsby and an associate named Jim French approached Station Agent Bristow in Nowata, Oklahoma, and stole approximately $190. This event added to the growing list of criminal acts linked to Goldsby during the final months of 1894. Jailbreak. Following the death of Ernest Melton, authorities significantly intensified their efforts to track down Crawford Goldsby and the remaining members of the Cook gang. With pressure mounting, the gang decided to separate in hopes of avoiding capture. Most members of the group were eventually apprehended or otherwise removed from active pursuit. Goldsby, however, managed to evade capture for a time. When a $1,300 reward, equivalent to approximately $50,135 in 2025, was offered for his arrest, individuals familiar with him came forward and offered their assistance. On January 31st, 1895, Goldsby was captured near Nowata, Oklahoma, by Ike Rogers and Clint Scales. He was then transported to Fort Smith, Arkansas, where he would be held while awaiting trial. On April 13, 1895, Goldsby was convicted for his involvement in Ernest Melton's death and was formally sentenced to capital punishment. However, his legal counsel successfully obtained a delay of the execution, allowing time for additional appeals. In June 1895, jail personnel discovered a firearm concealed in a bucket inside the Fort Smith jail. Goldsby claimed the weapon had been brought in by a prison trustee named Ben Howell, who allegedly left the jail and disappeared shortly afterward. During this period, Goldsby had developed a rapport with another trustee, Sherman Van, who later managed to smuggle a Colt revolver into Goldsby's cell. On July 26, 1895, Goldsby attempted an escape from jail. As the guards arrived for the nightly routine of securing inmates, he used the smuggled firearm to confront them. Guard Lawrence Keating was seriously wounded during the incident, and chaos briefly erupted within the facility. Though other guards responded, they were initially unable to re-enter the secured area to regain control. At that point, another inmate, Henry Starr, a known outlaw himself, volunteered to intervene. The guards agreed, and moments later, Starr returned with Goldsby, now disarmed, and brought the situation to a peaceful conclusion. Crawford Goldsby's second trial lasted for 3 days, ending with a guilty verdict. U.S. District Judge Isaac C. Parker, often referred to as the hanging judge, sentenced him to be executed on the September 10, 1895. However, a temporary stay was granted while Goldsby's legal team filed an appeal to the United States Supreme Court. On December 2, 1895, The Supreme Court upheld the original decision from the Fort Smith Court. Following that ruling, Judge Parker rescheduled the execution date for March 17, 1896. On the morning of the rescheduled date, Goldsby awoke at 6 a.m. and was allowed a moment outside for a smoke. He then had a light breakfast that had been prepared and sent over by his mother from a nearby hotel. At 9:20 a.m., his mother and Auntie Amanda Foster, who had cared for him as a young boy, were granted a final visit to his cell. A short time later, Father Pius, a Catholic priest, also arrived. Goldsby had voluntarily spent time in spiritual conversation with the priest during the 5 days leading up to the execution. Although the execution was originally scheduled for 11 a.m., it was delayed until 2 p.m. to allow time for his sister Georgia to see him one last time. She was traveling on an eastbound train, expected to arrive by 1 p.m. at Fort Smith. Shortly after 2 p.m., Goldsby was brought to the gallows. When asked if he had any final words, he reportedly replied, "I came here to die, not to make a speech." Within approximately 12 minutes, his life came to an end. Goldsby's body was placed in a coffin, which was then set into a shipping box and taken to the Missouri Pacific Depot. His mother, Ellen, and sister Georgia accompanied the remains by train to Fort Gibson, Oklahoma, where he was buried in the Cherokee National Cemetery. Over a year later, on April 20th, 1897, a man named Ike Rogers, who had reportedly played a key role in capturing Goldsby, was shot and killed in Fort Gibson by Clarence Goldsby, Crawford's brother. The circumstances surrounding the incident remain part of the lingering legacy of the Goldsby family and their place in the history of Indian Territory. In popular culture, the story of Cherokee Bill has continued to capture the interest of filmmakers and audiences well into the modern era. In the 2021 Western film, The Harder They Fall, directed by Jamie Samuel, the character of Cherokee Bill is portrayed by actor Lakeith Stanfield. The movie presents a fictionalized version of historical figures from the Old West and reimagines their stories through a modern cinematic lens. Decades earlier, in 1955, actor Pat Hogan played Cherokee Bill in an episode of the syndicated television series Stories of the Century. The show, which featured real-life outlaws from the American West, was narrated and starred Jim Davis in the lead role. These portrayals reflect the lasting impact of Crawford, Cherokee Bill, Goldsby's legacy on American popular culture, and the continued fascination with figures from the frontier era. Cherokee Bill's legend still echoes through the dusty trails of the Old West, a young man shaped by a turbulent era, feared by lawmen, and remembered as one of the most infamous outlaws to ever ride across Indian territory. He wasn't just a product of his time, he became a symbol of it. Fast, unpredictable, and shrouded in myth, Cherokee Bill's story is a chilling reminder of how quickly a life can spiral from promise to peril on the rugged frontier.
Please like and share if you find the video content interesting and useful. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment below so as not to miss the upcoming interesting videos. Thanks for watching.